Inversión, macro, bolsa, cripto y mercados. En Más que Mercados, analizamos la actualidad, las últimas noticias y todos los factores que afectan a tus inversiones.
La educación financiera cambia vidas.
De lunes a jueves a las 3:30 p.m. hora española, el mejor programa de economía, inversión y trading de habla hispana. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo y en directo. Acompáñanos con la guía experta de José y Álvaro Basagoiti y analiza con nuestros invitados las mejores estrategias de inversión y los portafolios corporativos de su firma. También podrás hacer tus propias consultas sobre acciones y mercados en tiempo real. Únete a nosotros de lunes a jueves a las 3:30 hora española y no te pierdas las mejores entrevistas e invitados. Descubre cómo hacer crecer tu patrimonio de manera inteligente solo en Más que Mercados de Trading Pro TV.
Muy buenas, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis de nuevo, amigos y amigas, para este especial de Más que Mercados con la comparecencia de Jerome Powell? Vamos a escucharla en vivo en poquitos minutos. Vamos a conectar directamente con la Reserva Federal para escuchar lo que tiene que decir el presidente Jerome Powell en una comparecencia importante. Ya hemos conocido que no se bajan tipos, se ha pausado. Esto lo teníais contado el mercado. Los swaps, de hecho, daban 99,3 de posibilidades, es decir, no había sorpresa y por eso no hemos visto mucha reacción del precio. Está cayendo la bolsa, pero no tiene nada que ver con esta pausa, porque repito, ya se había puesto en precio, ya estaba cotizando esta probabilidad, ¿no? Eso sí, lo que no sabemos es si va a tener un tono hawkish o dovish ahora mismo Jerome Powell. En semanas pasadas hemos visto declaraciones de muchos de los miembros del FONC y hemos visto más bien un tono complaciente. Por ejemplo, Waller, el último que ha hablado, fue extremadamente dovish, diciendo que podía haber hasta 3 o 4 recortes de tipos, que iba bien controlada la inflación y por tanto no había por qué mantener los tipos altos para agravar, en este caso, una posible estrés financiero a muchas empresas con ese muro de vencimientos que tenemos, ¿no? Por tanto, vamos a ver el tono de Powell, porque sabemos que es de la escuela más agresiva, ¿no? Del grupo de halcones, ¿no? Que tiene dentro la Reserva Federal. Y además lo hacen un día en el que viene cayendo, como digo, el S&P 500 a grave. Sabéis que nosotros en Trading Pro estamos cortos. De hecho, en Más que Mercados, en el programa que tenemos en directo de 3:30 a 5, de lunes a jueves, todos los días, si alguien nos está viendo por primera vez, que sepan que estamos, insisto, en directo repasando las posiciones de nuestras carteras todos los días, ¿eh? Mañana también estaremos, así que nos podéis seguir. Ayer de hecho abríamos el corto del S&P 500. Bueno, está cerca de profit ya, ¿eh? Estamos en los entornos de los 6.000 puntos. Lo vendimos en 6.060, así que ya ganando esos 60 puntos al S&P 500. De momento caídas importantes. Recordad que estamos en todo el tsunami de DeepSeek. Yo insisto que no creo que esto sea motivo para tener un sell-off, ni mucho menos en los mercados. Esto es la famosa paradoja de Jevons. Sí, hay un modelo más eficiente, como puede ser DeepSeek, que consigue entrenar a una IA con una capacidad cognitiva similar a la OpenAI a mucho menor coste de entrenamiento y coste de uso. Esto no es malo. De hecho, pone un escalón ya encima de la carrera para que siguientes players puedan empezar con un escalón más ya jugado. Bien, cuando tú generas una tecnología más eficiente, lo que haces es bajar las barreras de entrada para que más players, más agentes puedan entrar en el mercado y por tanto al final vas a tener todavía más demanda de los inputs que por ejemplo vende Nvidia. Mucha gente decía que esto iba a perjudicar mucho a los futuros números de Nvidia porque se iban a quitar menos GPUs. Bueno, eso con los plays actuales, pero si esto es más eficiente y entran más jugadores, va a haber más demanda agregada y por tanto se va a seguir sosteniendo posiblemente esos números, ¿no? No es tan sencillo todo como se puede interpretar inicialmente. Yo no creo que sea este movimiento schumpeteriano algo negativo y creo que para la batalla, la lucha por la IA, para la velocidad de avance va a ser muy positivo. Que haya competencia siempre es bueno. De todas formas, los mercados hoy van a estar más centrados en Powell, que está con un dilema importante, que es que se acaba el repo inverso. Ahora mismo lo que necesita el sistema es liquidez. Y no olvidemos que la Fed está ahora mismo aplicando QT. QT, que es reducción de balance del Banco Central. Es decir, está extrayendo, drenando liquidez del sistema. Lo equilibra con la liquidez que inyecta vía repo inverso. ¿Qué pasa? ¿Cuál es el problema? Que el repo inverso se está agotando. Está llegando a cero. Por lo tanto, cuando llega a cero esa liquidez, va a tener que reducir o eliminar el QT y volver al QE. De eso seguramente hablará hoy. Vamos a escucharle, porque arranca ya Jerome Powell, presidente de la Reserva Federal. Vamos con él.
To leave our policy interest rate unchanged and to continue to reduce our securities holdings. I'll have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators suggest that economic activity has continued to expand at a solid pace. For 2024 as a whole, GDP looks to have risen above 2%, bolstered by resilient consumer spending. Investment in equipment and intangibles appears to have slowed in the fourth quarter, but was strong for the year overall. Following weakness in the middle of last year, activity in the housing sector seems to have stabilized. In the labor market, conditions remain solid. Payroll job gains averaged 170,000 per month over the past 3 months. Following earlier increases, the unemployment rate has stabilized since the middle of last year, and at 4.1% in December remains low. Nominal wage growth has eased over the past year, and the jobs-to-workers gap has narrowed. Overall, a wide set of indicators suggest that conditions in the labor market are broadly in balance. The labor market is not a source of significant inflationary pressures. Inflation has eased significantly over the past 2 years, but remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% longer-run goal. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.6% over the 12 months ending in December, and that, excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.8%. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. We see the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals as being roughly in balance, and we are attentive to the risks on both sides of our mandate. Over the course of our 3 previous meetings, we lowered our policy rate by a full percentage point from its peak. That recalibration of our policy stance was appropriate in light of the progress on inflation and the rebalancing in the labor market. With our policy stance significantly less restrictive than it had been, and the economy remaining strong, we do not need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance. At today's meeting, the committee decided to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 4.25% to 4.5%. We know that reducing policy restraint too fast or too much could hinder progress on inflation. At the same time, reducing policy restraint too slowly or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. In considering the extent and timing of additional adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. We're not on any preset course. As the economy evolves, we will adjust our policy stance in a manner that best promotes our maximum employment and price stability goals. If the economy remains strong and inflation does not continue to move sustainably toward 2%, we can maintain policy restraint for longer. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly or inflation were to fall more quickly than anticipated, we can ease policy accordingly. Policy is well positioned to deal with the risks and uncertainties that we face in pursuing both sides of our dual mandate. As we previously announced, our 5-year review of our monetary policy framework is taking place this year. At this meeting, the committee began its discussions by reviewing the context and outcomes of our previous review that concluded in 2020, as well as the experiences of other central banks in conducting reviews. Our review will again include outreach and public events involving a wide range of parties, including Fed Listens events around the country and a research conference in May. Throughout this process, we will be open to new ideas and critical feedback, and we will take on board lessons of the last 5 years in determining our findings. We intend to wrap up the review by late summer. I would note that the committee's 2% longer-run inflation goal will be retained and will not be a focus of the review. The Fed has been assigned two goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation sustainably to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-run inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Steve.
Mr. Chairman, Steve Leisman from CNBC. Mr. Chairman, at a event in Davos, or from to Davos anyway, the president said he'll demand that interest rates drop immediately. So I guess I have a three-part question. Has the president done this to you? Has he made that demand? Secondly, what is your response to that? And third, what effect, if any, does a president making these kind of remarks have on policy? Thank you.
Three questions. I'm seeing it really as one question, though. So I'm not going to have any response or comment whatsoever on what the president said. It's not appropriate for me to do so. The public should be confident that we will continue to do our work as we always have, focusing on using our tools to achieve our goals and really keeping our heads down and doing our work, and that's how we best serve the public.
Can you just comment on whether he's physically communicated his demand to you?
I've had no contact.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Nick.
Nick Timmeros, The Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, you and several of your colleagues said around the time of the last meeting that your policy stance was meaningfully restrictive. Given economic and financial market developments since then, how has your confidence changed in an assessment that says interest rates are meaningfully restrictive?
I don't think that my assessment really has changed. I mean, a couple of things have happened. We've gotten more strong data, but we've also seen rates move up at the long end, which could represent a tightening in financial conditions. I think if we look back over the past year or so, we can see that policy is restrictive. If you look at the effect of high rates on interest-sensitive spending, for example, in housing, and if you look at the achievement of our goal variables, we're seeing the economy move toward 2% inflation and has moved largely to maximum employment. So we really look at the movement toward the goal variables to make that assessment. Now,
Bueno, titulares muy importantes y reacción del mercado. De momento parece que le gusta las palabras de Powell, que tiene un mensaje algo dovish. Ahora comentaremos el por qué. Bueno, en primer lugar ha dicho que las expectativas de inflación están bien ancladas. Es decir, parece que no le preocupa al seno de la banca central que se pueda descontrolar de nuevo la inflación. Puede haber repuntes, sabemos que la inflación nunca es lineal, pero parece que no teme porque se va a descontrolar, ¿no? Que vamos, pues eso, inflaciones del 4,5-5%, y dice que el camino con baches es el bueno, es el positivo. Por lo tanto, no hay que preocuparse demasiado. Hay que vigilar, evidentemente, es tarea de la Fed el control de la divisa, pero no parece preocuparle. Esto al mercado le ha gustado porque a priori, bueno, pues mantiene un poco la idea de seguir este ciclo de recorte de tipos a pesar de la pausa. Luego ha dicho, esto es muy importante, que el mercado laboral fuerte no es motivo para presiones inflacionistas, es decir, que no ve riesgos de repuntes inflacionarios porque el mercado laboral siga sólido, y sólido entre comillas. Hemos comentado muchas veces que es verdad que no hay despidos, pero tampoco hay contratación, y mucho del trabajo es part-time, no es full-time, y además trabajo valor añadido. Es decir, que el empleo de Estados Unidos no es tan bonito como lo pintan. Es verdad que tampoco es catastrófico porque no sube mucho el desempleo, pero desde luego esa falta de rotación es algo que hace, bueno, que acaba generando menos productivo la hora laboral, y por tanto no es oro todo lo que reduce. Pues desde luego, según Powell, no va a generar presiones inflacionistas aunque suban los salarios en términos reales, ¿no? Claro, todo esto es muy positivo. ¿Para qué? Para que en futuras reuniones, no digo justo la siguiente, pero a partir de la tercera año podamos ver de nuevo recorte de tipos, ¿no? Los swaps, lo está vigilando ahora mismo, de los Fed Funds, siguen sin dar probabilidades para que en la próxima reunión haya recorte de tipos. Es decir, se espera que la pausa sea prolongada. De hecho, luego ha dicho Powell que de momento la economía se ha mantenido bien con una política restrictiva, normalizando la política monetaria. Esto da pie a que la pausa actual no sea de una sola reunión, sino que sea una pausa prolongada. como estaba comentando, que se pueda extender incluso, veremos, hasta el segundo semestre, cuando que estemos 2-3 reuniones sin recortar tipos. Esto no es seguro, habrá que ir viendo los swaps de los Fed Funds, que son básicamente el precio que pone el inversor a que haya recorte de tipos, y lo que marca el repricing de los mercados lo iremos analizando en próximos días, pero de momento parece claro que la próxima reunión tampoco habrá recortes, o por lo menos es lo que está cotizando a día de hoy el mercado. El mercado siempre cotiza descuenta expectativas futuras, ¿no? Cotiza el escenario de mañana, así que ya pone probabilidades a lo que vaya a pasar en la próxima reunión y se pone en precio hoy. Por tanto, un Powell neutro, pero más tirando a dovish, y por eso estamos viendo subidas en los mercados, nada de otro mundo. Si me estaba rebotando ahora mismo, mucha volatilidad intradía, eso sí, perfecto para los traders, ¿verdad? Nos encantan estas jornadas, subiendo Nasdaq, subiendo algo S&P 500 y cayendo el dólar. Es que va siempre, como digo todo el rato, va descorrelacionado. Si suben bolsas, baja el dólar, sobre todo en ese tipo de eventos, ¿no? Por lo tanto, bueno, pues gustando el tono, se podía esperar peor. La Fed no recorta tipos y parece que, según las palabras de Powell, bien ancladas las expectativas de inflación, mercado laboral que no le preocupa, y parece que, eso sí, contento con este ajuste monetario y que haya conseguido el soft landing, que no haya llevado la subida de tipos de interés a una recesión, que era el gran objetivo que tenía la Reserva Federal, Banco Central de Estados Unidos, y que de momento lo ha conseguido. Realmente, fuera de errores que todos podemos pensar, nos va a gustar más o menos, la nota que tenemos que poner a Powell es muy positiva, desde luego mucho mejor que la de la señora Lagarde, ¿verdad? Madame Inflación, Christine Lagarde, que ha tenido un desempeño, desde mi punto de vista, bastante más nocivo para la región europea. Por lo tanto, bueno, vamos a escuchar de nuevo a Powell, que sigue hablando, y ahora me interesan sobre todo las preguntas de los periodistas, que suelen ser pues algo más, suelen buscarle más las cosquillas, ¿verdad? A un presidente, el de la Reserva Federal, que además no es un gran locutor. Vamos a escucharle de nuevo.
Happen in the economy, how you see it developing.
Well, at all times, forecasts are conditional at a minimum on just a set of expectations, and they're highly uncertain in both directions. We know that economic forecasting is really difficult beyond just a month or two out. So in the current situation, there's probably some elevated uncertainty because of significant policy shifts in those four areas that I mentioned: tariffs, immigration, fiscal policy, and regulatory policy. So there's probably some additional uncertainty, but that should be passing. We should go through that, and then we'll be back to the regular amount of uncertainty. So, what forecasters are doing, not just us, but everybody's doing, is they've got sort of just a set of assumptions about what might happen, but they're really kind of in the nature of a placeholder, and meaning, plausible could be, but honestly, you wouldn't stand behind it because you just don't know, and so you're just on hold, waiting to see what comes down. It's a very large economy, and policy is affected at the margin, but we're going to wait and see.
If I can follow up, the idea that you feel the economy, that policy is restrictive, suggests that the Fed in general wants to continue to lower interest rates. So when you look at the data that you are dependent on, are you looking for data that tell you that you can cut, or data that will tell you you should hold?
We're looking. It's more the way it works is we are looking at the data to guide us in what we should do, and that's what we do. And right now, we feel like we're in a very good place. Policy is well positioned. The economy is in quite a good place, actually, as well. And what we do expect is to see further progress on inflation, and as I mentioned, as we see that, or if we were to see weakening in the labor market, that could foster, we could then be in a position of making further adjustments. But right now, we don't see that, and we see things as in a really good place for policy and for the economy, and so we feel like we don't need to be in a hurry to make any adjustments.
Howard.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thank you very much. In 2021 at a central bank conference, you said, quote, Throughout my career in both public and private sectors, I've seen that the best and most successful organizations are often the ones that have a strong and persistent commitment to diversity and inclusion. These organizations consistently attract the best talent by investing in and retaining a world-class workforce. First question is, do you still believe that? And if so, how do you intend to put that belief into practice while remaining consistent with the recent executive order prohibiting diversity and inclusion efforts?
So let me say yes in answer to your first question, but to the second question, I want to say this. We are, like others, we're reviewing the orders and the associated details as they're made available, and as has been our practice over many administrations, we are working to align our policies with the executive orders as appropriate and consistent with applicable law. And I want to add that I'm not going to have anything more specific for you today on this whole set of issues.
Well, if I could just follow up quickly on that, I'm wondering how you're getting that to be consistent with the Dodd-Frank law's stipulations about maintaining an Office of Minority and Women's Inclusion.
So I did mention consistent with applicable law, right?
Un apunte importante, ahora seguimos escuchando a Powell, pero creo que ha sido muy interesante lo que ha comentado. Le han preguntado por Donald Trump, esto es lo que quería escuchar. Ha hecho que no es apropiado hablar en público de esas injerencias que puede hacer el presidente sobre la actuación de la Fed, cuando en teoría, y pongo comillas, son organismos independientes. Sabemos que esto es mentira, esto es falaz, pero de cara al público tienen que seguir vendiendo que una cosa es el Tesoro y otra cosa es la banca central, y que no hay comunicación entre ellos, que hay independencia a la hora de actuar. Esto es mentira, evidentemente, pero desde luego es lo que tiene que decir Powell, es su responsabilidad, ¿no?, para que el inversor, el acreedor de Estados Unidos no pierda la confianza, ¿no? Por lo tanto, parece que, y además Donald Trump esto lo sabe, y sobre todo su secretario de Tesoro, Scott Bessent, que ha sido muy claro: no vamos a interferir en la política de la Reserva Federal. Ellos tendrán que hacer su trabajo, tiene 3 mandatos: pleno empleo, estabilidad de la divisa y también la estabilidad financiera. No nos olvidemos, el mandato que todo el mundo olvida, pero es que no haya mucha volatilidad tampoco en el mercado de deuda y también, por cierto, el mercado de renta variable. A día de hoy, los bancos centrales son cuidadores de los mercados. Esto es lo que tenemos que entender. Y también le han preguntado por las tarifas, los aranceles. Y cuidado, interesantísimo, que es cuando empezó a subir el mercado de forma muy agresiva. Bueno, ya venía con un tono dovish, pero ha dicho, no están afectando los aranceles a la parte larga de la curva. Algo sí a la parte corta, pero la que importa, la que mira las condiciones financieras, es la parte larga de la curva. Los bonos de largo plazo, de 10, 20, 30 años, y ahí no se está generando tensión. Por lo tanto, no nos preocupa demasiado los aranceles. Yo siempre he comentado lo mismo. Los aranceles no son inflacionarios. Pueden provocar una pequeña subida general de precios, puntual, que es una subida impositiva, pero no generan una pérdida de valor de la divisa, del dólar en este caso. Eso es inflación, cuando el dólar se envilece. Bien, por lo tanto, hablamos de una subida de precios puntual, pero no va a ser continuada. A eso no se llama inflación. Se puede llamar otra cosa, subida de precios, mayores impuestos, pero no inflación. Y por eso creo que la Reserva Federal no tiene que tomar decisiones en base a que se tomen o no aranceles. Y creo que lo ha explicado muy bien Jerome Powell. Aquí ha estado bien, hay que reconocérselo, y por eso el mercado enseguida ha subido de manera bastante fuerte. De hecho, tenemos ahora en intradía, evidentemente, pues viendo velas importantes en Nasdaq, S&P 500 y caídas del dólar, ¿no? Vamos a seguir escuchando a Powell. Está muy interesante la comparecencia. Por cierto, si alguien nos ve de nuevas, como siempre, suscribiros al canal, que hacemos mucho contenido de valor y estamos siempre al pie del cañón con los eventos macro. Vamos a escuchar al presidente.
Last month, you talked about a future rate cut as being pretty, significantly predicated on more progress in inflation. With the characterization of the labor market in the statement today, would you say that that's even more so the case now?
I'd say it's the same. We want to see, further progress on inflation. And, the story's there. We're just going to have to see the data. At the end of the day, it comes down to 12-month inflation, because that takes out the seasonality issues that may exist. And, we're just going to need to see that. we see the pathway for that to happen. One example, a key example, is that you now do see owner's equivalent rent and housing services, the way it's calculated for PCE. You see that coming down pretty steadily now, and that's the place where most of the remaining gap is. In addition, a big part of the overrun, as you will know, was from non-market services, which don't tend to send much signal. So you can look through all that and think, okay, that then we seem to be set up for further progress. But being seen to set up for it is one thing, having it is another. So we're going to want to see further progress on inflation. Remember, we're not, we're under 2%, but our goal is 2%, and we do mean to get back sustainably to 2%.
And in terms of the labor market, I mean, how is that broadly, you said a broad set of indicators show that it's in a pretty solid place. Was there broad agreement on that? There's been a few underlying indicators that are showing perhaps some weakness, a low hiring rate, workers reporting that it's increasingly difficult to find a job. Is that of concern to the committee?
So you're right. I mean, we look at, of course, a very broad range. And so it starts with unemployment, with the unemployment rate, employment participation, wages, job quits, are people quitting, that kind of thing. The ratio of vacancies to unemployed. We look at all those things, and you put your finger though on it's a low hiring environment. So if you have a job, it's all good. But if you have to find a job, the job finding rate, the hiring rates have come down, and that's more typical of a. Let's say that the unemployment, that the labor market is at a sustainable level. It's not overheated anymore. We don't think we need it to cool off anymore. We do watch it extremely carefully. It's one of our 2 goal variables. But I'd say we watch those things quite carefully. But nonetheless, overall, look at the aggregate data in the labor market. The labor market does seem to be pretty stable and broadly in balance when you've got an unemployment rate that has been pretty stable now for a full half a year.
Edward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. On employment, now you said there's a broad range of possibilities, but last September you said, quote, "We understand that there's been quite an influx across the borders, and that has actually been one of the things that's allowed unemployment rate to rise." Now that the flow of the border has slowed and we're seeing deportations, how do you expect the unemployment rate to react?
So what's happening is that the flows across the border have decreased very significantly, and there's every reason to expect that to continue. But job creation has come down a bit too. So, if those 2 things come down together, that sort of can be a reason for the unemployment rate to stabilize. In other words, the break-even rate, as population growth slows, the break-even rate that you need in new jobs to make jobs for workers declines as well. So that seems to be something about what's happening. You do see a very flat unemployment rate at a time when you've seen significant declines.
I want to ask you about Fed employment. I know that tax money is not used here, but Elon Musk alleges that the Fed is, quote, absurdly overstaffed. We've seen the executive branch push to reduce the federal workforce. I just want to get your reaction.
We run a very careful budget process. We're fully aware that we owe that to the public, and we believe we do that. I've got no further comment than that. Thanks.
Chris.
Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. President Trump has said he will lower inflation by reducing gas and energy costs. Do you see such costs as a particular driver of inflation, and would lowering them have a dramatic effect?
Chris, I'm not going to react or discuss anything that any elected politician might say, so I'll give you a mulligan.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, nearly 2 weeks ago, the Fed said it was withdrawing from the network for greening the financial system, even as we have significant wildfires in Los Angeles doing billions of dollars in damage. And of course, the NGFS, as you know, is a group to talk about how the financial system could address climate change. Many commentators did see the timing as political. Why did you leave that organization? Can you explain that decision?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we considered this, really at length, and we did decide to withdraw from the NGFS. And really the reason is that the work that the NGFS does has broadened very significantly. Think about nature-related risks and biodiversity and things like that. In addition, the work of the NGFS is in significant part intended to, and this is a quote, mobilize mainstream finance to support the transition toward a sustainable economy. So we joined to get the benefit of understanding what other central banks were doing and seeing research and things like that. I think this is just way beyond any plausible mandate that you could attribute to the Fed. And so we have a quite narrow role, as I've said many times, and I think that the activities of the NGFS are not a good fit for the Fed, given our current mandate and authority. So, and I just think it was time to acknowledge that, this process dates back, thinking about it dates back a couple of years.
Bueno, ahora volvemos con Powell, pero quiero ver quién es el claro ganador de todo esto. Bitcoin, la subida ha sido tremenda, ¿verdad? Fijaros, ha bajado de los 101.300 hasta llegando a los 113.500 ahora mismo, Es una subida, muchos comentabais aquí por el chat, seguro que Powell tiene bitcoins, me gustaría saberlo, Algún día si el bueno de J. Powell invierte o tiene bitcoins, quién sabe, ¿no? Nunca se ha mostrado muy favorable, pero bueno, quizá, ¿no? Le preguntaban cosas interesantes, por ejemplo, por las deportaciones. Yo estaba diciendo que tendrá que ver el presidente de la Banca Central con la política migratoria de Estados Unidos. Esto es como cuando a Christine Lagarde le preguntan por el cambio climático. Digo, a ver, céntrate en la política económica, en la inflación. Bueno, es verdad que puede tener algo relacionado con el mercado laboral, de eso por ahí lo ha intentado meter con pitas, pero bueno, realmente preguntas que creo que sobran. Y ha hecho una cosa interesante Powell, porque decía, bueno, si ahora mismo tienes trabajo, estás muy bien, no hay problema, pero si no lo tienes, es complicado encontrar porque no hay contratación. Lo que os decía, que hay muy poca rotación en el mercado laboral. Este es el problema que adolece Europa, A veces que es muy complicado contratar por la rigidez que tiene el mercado laboral. Está empezando a pasar a Estados Unidos. Bueno, vamos a hacer un repaso rápido a mercados. Como digo, el Bitcoin, la subida es muy fuerte. Esto es en intraday para que veáis. Venía hoy con muchas dudas y le ha sentado bien la declaración de Powell. Y las bolsas, pues fijaros, teníamos este S&P 500 que había llegado a caer justo a los 6.000 puntos, una zona de soporte psicológica, una zona de un muro, ya sabéis, en el mercado de opciones de mucho volumen, y aquí es donde se ha producido el rebote. Como digo, sobre todo ha sentado muy bien ese comentario sobre los aranceles, que no van a implicar a priori decisión de tipos, en este caso de alargar o atrasar más los recortes de tipos, y de momento está subiendo bastante, ¿no? 50 puntos en muy poquito tiempo, es decir, que parece que ha gustado al mercado. Ya sabéis que un mandato no escrito, como siempre decimos, de la Fed también es la estabilidad financiera y, bueno, pues se trata siempre de buscar una comunicación amigable con los mercados, y de momento S&P subiendo, también Nasdaq, que venía hoy también con caídas y bueno, caídas, como digo, con este terremoto que tenemos de Dixie, con estas dudas, ¿no? Con este CAPEX invertido por las grandes tecnologías, como hemos comentado antes. Yo no creo que suponga un problema, porque ya lo comenta la paradoja de Gibbons, ¿verdad? Que cuando tú haces un sistema más eficiente como el que puede ser Dixie, lo que haces es eliminar o barreras de entrada a nuevos players. Esto va a generar más demanda de los outputs y por lo tanto, a priori, vas a generar al final más demanda energética, más demanda de GPUs. Es decir, no creo que haya problemas porque haya un modelo más eficiente. Esto es una carrera, lo que importa es el futuro, no el pasado, ¿no? Se ha hecho modelos ineficientes, se empezarán a dar modelos más eficientes, y mañana será un modelo todavía más eficiente que dejará a DeepSeek R1 en el ostracismo. Es decir, que esto nunca ha sido un problema, es un momento muy schumpeteriano, ¿no? La famosa destrucción creativa, y nunca ha sido un problema más allá del ruido de corto plazo, ¿no? Entonces los mercados creo que pues vienen reaccionando de forma positiva. Una sesión hoy que al final nos va a cenar prácticamente plana. No olvidemos que ahora en poquitos minutos conoceremos resultados de Tesla, de Meta y de Microsoft, Tres de las magníficas, cuidado, porque se va a juzgar mucho, sobre todo la inversión en CAPEX. Desde mi punto de vista va a tirar expectativas fácilmente, pero bueno, como sabéis, son empresas que cotizan a múltiplos muy elevados, y con que patine una de sus unidades de negocio pueden ser castigadas en el mercado. Eso es lo que va a mover ahora las bolsas. Creo que Powell ya le queda poco, vamos a volver a escucharle las últimas preguntas, pero creo que está el pescado vendido, así que tocará esperar a cierre mercado en el after para ver la confesión de esas tres magníficas, como digo, Tesla, Meta y Microsoft. No es poco, vaya día hoy, vaya sesión de trading tremenda. Por cierto, antes de ir con Powell, recordar que esta es la cuenta que operamos en Trading Pro. Hoy hemos cerrado el corto en S&P 500 antes de Powell, hemos seguido sumando, tenemos ya un beneficio del 30%, cuenta abierta en septiembre, que además está auditada, ya lo sabéis, en MQL5, fijaos la curva, ya pasamos el drawdown que tuvimos y estamos ya en máximos de rentabilidad, en el 30%. Así que, bueno, operativa que vamos haciendo diariamente más que mercados, muy contentos con el performance. Y como sabéis, aquí en Trading Pro queremos apostar por educación financiera y enseñar, o tratar de enseñar por lo menos, a generar rentabilidad, a que cada uno sepa planificar sus finanzas, construir patrimonio, para no depender en un futuro de esas transferencias estatales ni de un sistema de pensiones que está medio quebrado, ya lo sabéis, ¿no? Así que hay que conocer los mercados, como siempre, filosofía fundamental, filosofía cuantitativa, filosofía técnica, la unión de todas nos hará batir al mercado. Vamos a por lo menos intentarlo, que es el objetivo, esa meta que todos debemos tener, que es la libertad financiera. Vamos a escuchar de nuevo a Powell, vamos a ver cómo se despide de la audiencia y las últimas preguntas. Vamos con el presidente.
Differences, and I just think the range of possibilities is very, very wide. We just don't know, and I don't want to start speculating, as tempting as it is, because we really don't know. And we didn't know, by the way, in 2000 and I guess 18. Yeah, we didn't really know, and again, the range of possibilities very, very wide. We don't know what's going to be tariffed. We don't know for how long or how much, what countries. We don't know about retaliation. We don't know how it's going to transmit through the economy to consumers. That really does remain to be seen. You know, there are lots of places where that price increase from the tariff can show up between the manufacturer and the consumer. Just so many variables, so we're just going to have to wait and see. And the best we can do is what we've done, which is study up on this and look at historical experience, read the literature, and think about the factors that might matter. And then we'll just have to see how it goes.
Courtney.
Thank you. Courtney Brown from Axios. Two unrelated questions. The first is whether or not there was any discussion about QT and the timeline for ending QT at this meeting. And then the second question is just, I wonder if the AI-prompted sell-off in the stock market this week signaled anything to you about the state of financial conditions?
So, let's talk about runoff. So the most recent data do suggest that reserves are still abundant. Reserves remain roughly as high as they were when runoff began, and the federal funds rate has been very steady within the target range. We track a bunch of metrics, and they do tend to point to reserves being abundant. We do intend to reduce the size of our balance sheet to a level that's consistent with implementing monetary policy efficiently and effectively in our ample reserves regime. We're closely monitoring a range of indicators to assess conditions, and that should provide signals whether reserves are approaching a level that could be judged as, quote, somewhat above ample. I don't have anything to say to you about particular dates. It's just that's the process, and what we see is that rates do appear to be abundant. As always, we stand ready to take appropriate action to support that smooth transition of monetary policy, including to adjust the details of our approach for reducing the size of the balance sheet in light of economic and financial developments. On AI, it's a big event in the stock market and in particular parts of the stock market. I mean, what really matters for us is macro developments, and that means substantial changes in financial conditions that are persistent for a period of time. So I wouldn't put that label on these events, although, of course, we're all watching it with interest.
Simon.
Simon Rabinovich with The Economist. Thank you. You mentioned in your remarks that activity in the housing sector seems to have stabilized. At the same time, since your first rate cut in September, long-term mortgage rates have gone up by a full percentage point, back above 7%. I'm wondering, kind of looking forward, are you confident that activity will remain stable given how elevated mortgage rates are? How does it fit into your broader thinking about the economy?
So, as you know, as we've reduced our policy rate 100 basis points, longer rates have gone up, not because of expectations, not principally because of expectations about our policy or about inflation. It's more a term premium story. So, and it's long rates that matter for housing. So, I don't think I think these higher rates are going to they're probably hold back housing activity to some extent if they're persistent. We'll have to see how long they persist. So we control an overnight rate. Generally, it propagates through the whole family of asset prices, including interest rates. But in this particular case, it's all happened at a time when, for reasons unrelated to our policy, longer rates have moved up.
Jennifer.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. You said you want to see further progress on inflation. Given that households appear to be unhappy with the elevated level of prices, do you believe the committee should wait until inflation has fallen back to target to cut rates again?
No, I wouldn't say that. We've never said we need to be all the way at target to reduce rates. At any time, what we're doing is we're looking at the economy and asking whether our policy stance is the right one to achieve maximum employment and price stability. So I think if we would want to see further progress, but we think our, as I mentioned, we think that our policy stance is restrictive, meaningfully restrictive, not highly restrictive, but meaningfully restrictive. And so I would think we need to see further progress. I wouldn't say all the way back down to 2% on a sustainable basis, although we'd love to see that, of course, and we will.
And a separate question for you on tariffs. Curious whether the threat of tariffs and not knowing whether they could stick or not creates uncertainty for business here in the United States and could cause them to pull back, ultimately weighing on growth. Does the threat of tariffs cause you to ponder your growth forecast?
You know, I want to avoid commenting even indirectly on the conduct of tariffs. You know, it's not our job, and it's not our job to comment on the moves that people make. So I wouldn't want to criticize anything that's happening or really comment on it one way or another, praise it for that matter. It's just not our job. I do think that, you know, we found in 2018 there was a lot of work done on trade policy uncertainty. Trade policy uncertainty, if it's large and persistent, can start to matter for businesses making investment decisions and things like that. That's not something I'm observing today. It's very early days for this, but that did, I think that did matter in 2018-19, and it's one, you know, one of many things we'll be watching.
Matt.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Matt Egan from CNN. Following up on Courtney's question from earlier about the stock market, how concerned are you, if at all, about potential asset bubble brewing in financial markets? How do relatively high market valuations factor into considerations about potentially lowering interest rates further? Is that something that's in the back of your mind?
So we look at, from a financial stability perspective at asset prices generally, along with things like leverage in the household sector, leverage in the banking system, funding risk for banks and things like that. But it's just one of the four things asset prices are. And yeah, I'd say they're elevated by many metrics right now. A good part of that, of course, is this thing around tech and AI. But we look at that. But, you know, we look at how resilient the households and businesses and the financial sector are to those things. So we look at that mainly from a financial stability perspective, and we think that there's a lot of resilience out there. Banks have high capital, and households are actually overall, not all households, but in the aggregate, households are in pretty good shape financially these days. So that's how we think about that. You know, we look at overall financial conditions, and you can't just take equity prices. You've got to look at rates too, and that, you know, that represents a tightening in conditions with higher rates. So overall, financial conditions are probably still somewhat accommodative, but it's a mixed bag.
Richard.
Hi, Chair Powell. I'm Richard Escobedo with CBS News. One question for you. This month's statement notes that unemployment is stabilized at a low rate and that the labor market is solid. You walked through some of what's driving this, but I wonder what risks you see that might challenge your assessment.
Well, the things we discussed earlier, one is that there's a low hiring rate. And so that if there were to be a spike in layoffs, if companies were to start to reduce headcount, you would see unemployment go up pretty quickly because the hiring rate is quite low. So that's one thing we look at. I think it's worth pointing out that for lower income households, they're under significant pressure. And in the aggregate, the numbers are good, but we know that people at the lower end of the income spectrum are struggling with costs, and really it's high inflation for the basics of life. It's not so much the inflation now, it's the price level, because inflation has raised prices. Inflation is now much closer to target, but people are really feeling that. But overall, this is a good labor market. You're at 4.1% unemployment. That's just a really good level, and you've been solidly there now for 6-7 months. And job creation is pretty close to a level that will hold the unemployment rate there, given that there'll be much slower population growth.
One more question. Some of the uncertainty around immigration policy, in your assessment, is that making it harder for businesses and the Fed to plan going forward?
We hear anecdotal reports, but I don't see there's nothing in the data yet on that. But you hear that kind of thing about construction, for example, and businesses that are dependent on immigrant labor are saying that it's suddenly gotten harder to get people. But again, I know you don't see that in the aggregate data yet. But yes, you hear it anecdotally.
Nick.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Nicholas Jasinski from Barron's. The uncertainty is certainly a theme today, and I'm wondering, are there any periods from your career, or as it relates to markets, the economy, what's going on here in Washington and beyond, or from lessons from history that may provide some guidance for a central banker operating in uncertain times like today?
I guess I'd say this. Uncertainty is with us all the time. It is human nature, apparently, to underestimate how fat the tails are in a way. The possibility, we think of things in a normal distribution, and in the economy it's not a normal distribution. The tails are very fat, meaning things can happen way out of your expectations. It's never not that way. I wouldn't, if you think about it, think about the first few months of the pandemic. That was uncertainty. Are we going to be able to reopen the economy? If so, when? How much of it? How long will it take? That was uncertainty. What we have now is a good labor market. We have the economy growing at 2 to 2.5%. Inflation's come down to now the headline inflation number was 2.6, and that's what the public experiences. We look at core because it's a better indicator of future inflation. So yes, the price level went up a lot for inflation, and people are feeling that, and they're not wrong. But so the kind of uncertainty we have is just a usual level of uncertainty about the economy, but then policies which are not for us to criticize or praise, really. Those are policies which people have been elected to implement. They're implementing them with a view to making a better economy. And so I wouldn't call this out as one of those times. I wouldn't compare it to the global financial crisis or anything like that, given that we have actually a very good economy right now.
Evan Reiser with Market News International. Chair Powell, is a March cut still on the table? And then additionally, are you looking to see better than expected data on inflation to cut, or are you looking for inflation data that roughly aligns with current forecasts?
So as I mentioned, the economy's strong, the labor market's solid, downside risks to the labor market appear to have abated, and we think disinflation continues on a slow and sometimes bumpy path. That tells me, and the other members of the committee, the broad sense of the committee actually is that we don't need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance. Your second question was?
Whether or not you need to see better than expected inflation data, or just inflation data that roughly aligns with your current forecasts?
It's one of those things, we'll know it when we see it, but more the expectation is that we will make continued progress. And that's what we want. We'll know it when we see it. It's going to have to be something that isn't just idiosyncratic. You're going to want to see continued progress with housing services inflation. You're going to want to see inflation behaving in a way that builds confidence that we are really making progress. That's what it's going to be. And I mean, is that better than our expectations? We expect to see that. It's just a question of when.
Scott.
To the table. Can you talk a little bit about why? Is that because you think that's the right target, or is it because you don't want to move the goalpost mid-game, or what's behind that?
I think that goal has served us well over a long period of time. It's also the sort of global standard. I think that if a central bank wanted to look at changing that, you wouldn't do it at a time when you're not meeting it anyway. I would not look at changing it anyway, but I certainly wouldn't look at it at a time when you're not meeting it. I mean, there's just no interest at all in changing it. If I'm being at all unclear, we're not going to change the inflation goal anytime soon.
And 5 years ago, if I can paraphrase what y'all decided, it was you're going to not raise interest rates preemptively to head off inflation until you see sort of the whites of the eyes of inflation, because the solid labor market was so beneficial. Have the last few years changed your thinking about that?
So what we really said was that we wouldn't look at a strong labor market and raise rates unless we saw some evidence of inflation. So the thought was that we'd seen really low levels of of unemployment with no sign of inflation. So why would you preemptively want to put people out of work in the absence of any kind of any evidence that suggested that this was not a sustainable level? It was a way of acknowledging how much humility we have about the starred variables, especially U-star, the natural rate of unemployment. So that was that was an insight. We'll discuss that again. That'll be one of the many things that we discuss. But I don't think that insight is wrong. We didn't, we said, what we said was that, at times when inflation persistently undershot 2%, we would likely allow inflation to run moderately above 2% for some time. That's what we said. That turned out not to be relevant to what actually happened. There was nothing moderate about the overshoot. It was an exogenous event. It was the pandemic, and it happened. And our framework permitted us to act quite vigorously, and we did once we decided that that's what we should do. The framework had really nothing to do with the decision to. We looked at the inflation as transitory, and right up to the point where the data turned against that. And when the data turned against that in late 21, we changed our view and we raised rates a lot. And here we are at 4.1% unemployment and inflation way down. But the framework was more irrelevant than anything else. That part of it was irrelevant. The rest of the framework worked just fine as we used it, as it supported what we did to bring inflation down.
Let's go to Mark for the last question.
Hello, Chairman Powell. Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. As you know, in the annual report from the Financial Stability Oversight Council, among the risks outlined is cryptocurrency. Could you talk about those risks now? And regarding individuals and households, perhaps distinct from the concern about the financial system, do you worry that speculation in this unregulated asset class could hurt their financial well-being, or do you think it has a place in a household's portfolio?
So our role with Bitcoin really is to look at, with crypto, really is to look at the banks, and we think it's, banks are perfectly able to serve crypto customers as long as they understand and can manage the risks, and it's safe and sound. A good number of our banks that we regulate and supervise do that. The threshold has been a little higher for banks engaging in crypto activities, and that's because they're so new, and we don't want to make the mistake. If you're making a choice to conduct that activity inside a bank, which is inside the federal safety net with deposit insurance, then you want to be pretty sure that it's a safe and sound activity. So, we're not against innovation, and we certainly don't want to take actions that would cause banks to terminate customers who are perfectly legal just because of excess risk aversion, maybe related to regulation and supervision. So.
And with respect to households and their inclusion in that asset class?
That's kind of it's not really our bailiwick. You want people to be knowledgeable about the financial engagements that they have, and that's why we have the securities laws that we have. It's why if you read a mutual fund prospectus or individual stock prospectus, you want households to have the chance to understand the risk that they're taking, and I do think it would be helpful if there were a greater regulatory apparatus around crypto, and I think that's something Congress was working on quite a lot. We've actually spent a lot of time, with members of Congress working together with them on various things, and I think that would be a very constructive thing for Congress to do. Thank you.
Ya está aquí. Ya está disponible nuestro curso definitivo de trading. No importa si eres un principiante o un experto en inversiones, este curso está diseñado para guiarte en cada paso del camino. Aprenderás sobre educación en independencia financiera, estructura del precio Fibonacci, ondas Elliott, lectura Wyckoff y mucho más. Pero lo más importante es que Álvaro y José Basagoiti te enseñarán a aplicar el exclusivo sistema de Trading Pro. No esperes más para comenzar tu aprendizaje. Visita tradingpro.app ahora y elige la opción que mejor se adapte a tus necesidades. ¿Y sabes qué es lo mejor? Si ya eres parte de la familia Trading Pro o has seguido nuestro programa en directo, te espera un descuento especial. Contáctanos hoy mismo para obtener el tuyo y aprovechar esta increíble oportunidad. La educación financiera cambia vidas. Inversión, macro, bolsa, cripto y mercados. En Más que Mercados, analizamos la actualidad, las últimas noticias y todos los factores que afectan a tus inversiones.
La educación financiera cambia vidas.
De lunes a jueves a las 3:30 p.m. hora española, el mejor programa de economía, inversión y trading de habla hispana. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo y en directo. Acompáñanos con la guía experta de José y Álvaro Basagoiti y analiza con nuestros invitados las mejores estrategias de inversión y los portafolios corporativos de su firma. También podrás hacer tus propias consultas sobre acciones y mercados en tiempo real. Únete a nosotros de lunes a jueves a las 3:30 hora española y no te pierdas las mejores entrevistas e invitados. Descubre cómo hacer crecer tu patrimonio de manera inteligente solo en Más que Mercados de Trading Pro TV.